This is a community initiative, and we have our community here. It's terrific. We've had broad participation in all of this. It is being driven by a governing board whose chair is Steve Dettelbach, who is the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio. And we have here today Carol Rendon, who is the first assistant U.S. Attorney for our district with responsibility for daily operations of that office. She's a Northwestern law grad who clerked on the U.S. Court of Appeals, served in the Attorney General's Honors Program in the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice, assigned to the Organized Crime Strike Force Unit in Boston. And then we got her back. She came home to Cleveland. She spent some years in private practice and is now with the U.S. Attorney's Office. So Carol will be our next speaker, and thank you all again from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, Janet. And so as you heard, my name is Carol Rendon. I'm the First Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio. And I want to start by welcoming you to this incredible conference. I mean, look at this room. This is amazing. These 2 days promise a wealth of information, opportunities for you to collaborate with one another, brainstorming, working on new ideas and new initiatives. My only concern is how you're going to pack all of this in to just 2 days. It's really an impressive agenda. But more importantly, I want to thank each and every one of you for the incredibly important and difficult work that you do every day, helping to protect the most vulnerable citizens in our community, our children. And I know that at some point during the conference, many of you, perhaps all of you, will have an opportunity to hear from the Chief of the Cleveland Police Department, Mike McGrath. Mike McGrath speaks incredibly passionately and eloquently from a law enforcement perspective about the impact of children having been exposed to violence. And for those of us in law enforcement, there's something that Chief McGrath often says which really resonates, and resonates for me in particular as both a prosecutor and a former defense attorney. And that is that we simply cannot arrest our way out of the problem of violence in our community. It isn't possible. It isn't the goal. It isn't what we should be focused on. We need to focus on reducing violence in our community. And instead, as each of you know, the key to reducing violence in our community is breaking the cycle of violence. And violence in our community has become an epidemic. It's an epidemic that for too long has been passed down literally from generation to generation. And it's now up to us to stop this cycle, to protect our children. Because as we all know too well, children who are exposed to violence all too often later in life engage in violent behavior. And so it goes from generation to generation. Therefore, if we can prevent our children from being exposed to violence in the first place, in their homes, in their schools, in their communities, and if we can help to fully heal those children who are exposed to violence so that they don't carry the scars of that trauma with them throughout their lives, then we really can change the future of our community. Today, our Defending Childhood Initiative has put Cuyahoga County at the forefront of this critically important effort to stem the tide of violence in America. And for those of you who don't know, this is the signature initiative of my Department of Justice, of my boss, Eric Holder. And here we are at the forefront of this national initiative, something we should all be incredibly proud of. Because together we have the opportunity to create a model for others, to find new and innovative and proven successful methods for dealing with violence in our community and our children's exposure to violence. And through our work, we're going to show the rest of the country how to stop this cycle, how to save our next generation. So I too want to take a minute and say a few thank yous. First to Jenna Suhodolnik from our office, who always helps put together all of these conferences, and without whom I don't know if any of us would know where we were supposed to go on any given day. To Craig Tame, who is our law enforcement coordinator and has been instrumental in helping to put together the Defending Childhood Initiative, along with Elsie Day, who you all know and who is a force of nature in her own right. and is just really the heart and soul of so much of what you all will be learning today and tomorrow. And Janet Cronenberg and her incredible Defending Childhood team. They have just been amazing partners helping to drive this to fruition, and I am incredibly proud to be associated with each and every one of them. They have really done something very special bringing this initiative to our county. And I also want to take a minute to thank each and every one of our state, federal, and local partners. Defending the Defending Childhood Initiative is a collaboration of many different organizations, some like my own, governmental agencies, others, nonprofit organizations, corporations, and of course, the faith community. Because we're all in this together. We can't do this, any one of us, on our own. We have to take our community and create that village that's going to help to raise all of our children. And finally, I want to channel for you all a huge welcome and thank you from our U.S. Attorney, Steve Dettelbach, who chairs the Defending Childhood Initiative. And for any of you who know Steve, you know how incredibly committed he is to this very, very important project. And but for the fact that he is on a previously scheduled, and I might add, very much deserved vacation with his wife in Europe, he wouldn't miss this for the world. In fact, I know he'd be here today with bells on if he could be. And so without any further ado, it's now my privilege and my honor to introduce our two plenary speakers for this afternoon. Our first speaker is Dr. David Wolf. Dr. Wolf is a psychologist and author. He specializes in issues affecting children and youth. He holds the inaugural RBC Chair in Children's Mental Health at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, where he is the head of the Center for Prevention Science, and that is located in London. He's also a professor of psychiatry and psychology at the University of Toronto, and in his spare time, he's editor-in-chief of Child Abuse and Neglect, the International Journal. He's the editor or co-editor of 9 books and numerous scholarly articles. His most recent publications include Growing Up with Domestic Violence, Assessment, Intervention, and Prevention Strategies for Children and Adolescents, something at the very heart of the Defending Childhood Initiative. He holds both a BA and MA in Political Science from Carleton University and a PhD from the University of Toronto. Our second plenary speaker today is Dr. Charles Figley. And Dr. Charles Figley is at Tulane University. Prior to joining the faculty at Tulane, he was at Florida State University. And there he was a full professor in the College of Social Work and also was the director of the oldest interdivisional PhD program in marriage and in family. In 1998, Dr. Figley established the Florida State University Traumatology Institute to focus on traumatic stress resilience. Dr. Figley has published more than 200 scholarly works, including 20 books and 114 refereed journal articles that report on research projects focusing primarily on stress and the resilience of individuals, families, and communities. He's an elected fellow of 5 of the leading national professional associations and has received numerous honors for his scholarship. In fact, both of these gentlemen, if I stood up here and read the list of awards and honors that they have received, you wouldn't have any time to hear from them until dinner tonight. So, very impressive group of speakers. Dr. Figley received his undergraduate degree from the University of Hawaii and his graduate degrees from the Pennsylvania State University. And so without further ado, I am so pleased and honored to introduce to you Dr. David Wolf.
Maybe I'll let our AV guy do this while I talk for a minute, because that might take a minute. Thanks. So maybe you didn't catch it, but someone Googled me there. I don't have a PhD in political science, but there is another David A. Wolf at the University of Toronto. This has happened before. It's kind of funny. Because everything else was accurate, but when I heard that I got a PhD in political science from the University of Carleton University, I thought, So the other David A. Wolf, who is in political science, and I meet every now and then to talk about emails that we get from one another or that are aimed for the other person. But anyway, I'm very happy to be here. I was part of the Defending Childhood evaluation team, and I've been to 8 different sites, and I have to tell you, don't tell the other 7 sites, but this is by far the most outstanding site that we've been to. It stood out as the most organized, the most integrated, the most community involved of any of the other sites. Don't tell them I said that. So you should all be very proud of yourself. And when I was asked to come here and talk to you, I said absolutely, because I wasn't able to come last December to some of your planning meetings due to snow in Ontario, but I'm delighted to be here now. I wanted to give you a quick 40-year history of why I'm standing here today and why I still remain involved with child abuse and neglect. I actually went to the University of Rochester. How many Rochester people here? A few of you. Back in the early 1970s, and I took a course in community psychology, which was new back then, and we were studying community interventions with police and how the police could go in and get involved with people such as domestic violence, which is kind of a new issue back then. And I thought, I really liked that idea. So I graduated, went out to San Francisco, went to the police department, that's no lie, and I said I want to be a community police officer. And they looked at me kind of funny and said, well, you have to go to police college first and carry a gun for a few years and that kind of thing. So I put that aside. Ended up being a bartender. Remember, this is a recession much like the one we're having today in the 70s. Through a lot of good luck, I ended up going to the University of South Florida for my PhD in Tampa. And then I ended up, of all places, moving to Canada. When I got there, I was poked and prodded by all the Canadians because no one ever moves from Florida to Canada. It's always the other way. So they wonder what was wrong with me and why would I do that? But I've now been there 30 years. In fact, I've been in Canada longer than I've been in the United States. Don't add up those 2 numbers because you'll know how old I am. And I'm delighted to be able to share my experiences there. Part of what I stayed there for is that their initiatives in domestic violence and child abuse in the 80s were very promising and very ahead of the curve, I think. And then I met Peter Jaffe. Peter, I met the first 2 months I was there. He was the one who had written the paper on policing and domestic violence when I was at the University of Rochester, and that was his dissertation. So I went in and I introduced myself and realized that he was the same person that I had actually admired and wanted to become a police officer for. We became instant friends. When an American comes in and praises a Canadian, you are an instant friend of that Canadian. I just want you all to know that. Peter and I have worked together now for 30 years. And what we noticed right at the beginning is he had a case in 1980-81 where a 15-year-old boy was charged with homicide. And the facts were very simple. Dad came home from work one day, boy was waiting in the garage with a loaded weapon. Dad came in the garage, he shot him, dead. So the Crown attorney at the time said it's pretty hands down. He submitted to it, there was witnesses, it's, no doubt he did it. The question was why he did it. And Peter was called to testify in that case because there was some evidence the boy had indicated and his mother of the violence that he had grown up with all of his life. And as you know where this story is going, that boy had grown up for 15 years witnessing horrible abuse of his mother. And he didn't know what else to do about it at the time. In the early 80s, the police had been called. They weren't able to do anything at that point. Remember, the laws were quite different then. There was a lot more discretion. So, needless to say, Peter did testify. It was revealed that there was defensible homicide or whatever they termed it at the time, and the boy did not end up being charged for that homicide. But what that told us at the time is that there's something going on in our society that we weren't aware of. We weren't paying enough attention to. My background was in child abuse and neglect. I had worked in Florida with abusive families and children in particular. And when Peter and I compared notes, we realized that these kids who were growing up in these violent homes witnessing the violence were no different than the ones that were getting hit by the parents. Lo and behold. And when we started to compare the developmental aspects of these kids, what was going on in their lives, of course they're going through the same types of harm, the same types of issues that we all knew was going on with child abuse and neglect. So this led us to start working with the shelters. The only literature on this topic back then was from women's shelters. And they were telling us about what these kids were going through, the difficulties that the infants were having settling down, the difficulties that preschoolers were having around their mother and their behavior problems and emotional development. We started to interview these children and recognize that these signs were very visible if you knew what you're looking at. Otherwise, they were being labeled as ADHD, they're being labeled as conduct problem kids, and so forth. We realize that kids now reflect what they live with. We often didn't know that before that simple rule. We figured that the kid had a problem. Instead, he was trying to show us the problem. We went on to discover that the reason that I want to share this with you today is that what happens with kids in their emotional development. Emotions are how kids learn to communicate as infants. That's the first way we learn to communicate in the world. You don't think about what you're going to say, you feel it. Now imagine with an infant, if they're hungry, they have to cry. It's the only way they can communicate. Pardon me. Now imagine kids also learn to transfer emotion. They pick up on the mood and the emotion in the room. That's what they're very good at. They are very attuned at that. That's what helps with their attachment. They have to be emotionally aware from infancy on. And this is how they communicate. If they're hungry, they have to give out those cues. Now imagine, because the child can't interpret what's going on, they have to feel what's going on. So we began to realize from an early age that kids pick up on that emotion in the home. And they reflect it in their behavior, because they can't interpret it, they can't understand it, but they can feel it. Imagine a child of 8-month-old, 10-month-old is in a crib asleep and hears screaming or yelling downstairs, and it doesn't take much to imagine what that kid is picking up on. Or a 4-year-old who thinks it's at the television set, is something going on downstairs, I don't know what it is. Trying to interpret what goes on as they get older, because that's what happens next, as they start to learn those types of things. This is what engaged me in studying the development of these children and how it harms them. This is what I'm going to share with you today. It's not just a matter of them having certain developmental outcomes or behavior problems. They're reflecting developmentally the disturbance that's going on throughout their life. It's upsetting everything about their developmental process. It's throwing it off kilter. That way you don't know where they're going to end up or what kind of problems they may show, because there isn't any simple outcome or direct outcome from this. I also grew involved in this and have stayed involved in it. I'm going to share with you at the end today this interest, and that is prevention. Ever since the beginning in the 70s when I was working with child abuse and neglect, I realized right away that these are issues, like the speaker before me said, that are more preventable than they are treatable. We should be doing a lot more up front. By the time these families come to our attention for intervention, we spend a lot of money and we don't get very far. We have to admit that. We still have to have interventions, obviously, and some are effective, but it's much more expensive and much more dangerous to wait that long. Nowadays, we know what we can be doing, and I'm going to show you some of those ideas in the talk today. So let me just start by showing this little clip. It was made by a group in I'm not going to be able to do this from here, am I? I'm going to have to go down here to do that. It's made in Australia, just to give you an idea, set the context for you. More and more communities like you are involving themselves in public education like this, just to bring awareness to a lot of people, to get them to think about some of the basic things that to many of us are so obvious. So let me go through now some of the literature, or some of the findings we've learned over the last 30 years, briefly, in terms of the impact of domestic violence on children, how common this is, what types of exposure they have, and so forth. First, the question is, what is exposure to violence? And we have, nowadays, we know all sorts of different types of violence that kids can be exposed to, school violence, domestic violence, and so forth. And I know in your communities you're interested in all of these issues, not just domestic violence. So, and the impact on children is often very similar, but as I'll point out in a minute, domestic violence has a particularly critical impact on children. How common is this? The best estimates for the U.S. data is about 5.5 million children based on interviews. And about half of these children are exposed to severe domestic violence, 7 million children. Now we know that these lessons that they're learning have to be taught by someone. Violence is learned, and we know someone has to be teaching it. These are the teaching episodes that these children are getting. It's reversible if we do something about it. Can everyone hear me back there all right? Okay. And the estimated is up to 300 million, close to 300 million children worldwide. People are, more and more agencies are trying to estimate these numbers, and these may shift, of course, but with more and more recognition of the significance of this, the UN and such, and WHO are trying to collect such information. Now, what kind of exposure are we talking about? Prenatal exposure to violence, because we know that neurobiologically the fetus can be affected by stress levels of hormones in the body. So even prenatally, exposure to violence can have a significant impact that we're learning. Exposure could be trying to stop the violence, victimized by one or both parents, participating, eyewitness, overhearing it, observing it, experiencing aftermath, and so forth. We have to keep in mind that these are all the ways that kids can be exposed to violence, not just a single episode of a certain type. But what I like to point out is what I call the children's paradox. And this is why I think domestic violence is particularly difficult for them to adapt to in any way. Because kids want to become a part of a family, and they're torn between a sense of loyalty towards that family and a sense of fear and apprehension. They want to stop the violence, but they want to belong to their family. Kids will protect their family. I used to work at our Children's Aid Society a day a week in London for many years, just so I would understand domestic violence and child abuse better. And I can not think of one case where a child said that they would prefer to be with someone else than their own parents, even if those parents were wickedly violent. Because kids will do everything to maintain that loyalty and to protect that sense of being part of a family. That's who they are. And it's very difficult then to overcome that. And because of that loyalty, they're going to adapt some of their family's values. Affection and attention may coexist. Because what the kids will say is, well, you know, my dad's not that bad. He takes me to the ball game once a year. And they'll overlook anything else that goes on. Minimize, deny, project blame, and so forth. And the intensity tends to increase over time. So this is the paradox that kids have to live with. It's not so easy, and it's the same paradox that that battered women have to live with. That it's not so easy to leave, that the decisions are not that clear. Culturally, some of you would be perhaps surprised to know the association between witnessing violence in the media in particular, or in the home, and the outcomes of violence in people's lives. This role of media and entertainment and promoting violence has received a lot of interest in the last 30 years. There's been a lot of reports written about it. There's been a lot of arguments on both sides that watching violence in the media, playing violent video games, doesn't cause people to be violent. No, it doesn't cause everyone to be violent, but it is a risk factor. And in pediatrics, 2 years ago, they published a review of this, over 2,000 studies. And when you look at that, to me it's pretty dramatic. The association between media violence and aggressive behavior is comparable to calcium intake and bone mass, to lead ingestion and lower IQ, to condom use and HIV, and to smoking and lung cancer. Yet, interestingly, in our societies, we continue to minimize this issue of media violence. And I know my colleagues in London are paying more and more attention to that. If you're interested in that, I'll show you in a minute. Because this is how, as I say, if violence is learned, someone's teaching it. And if you see some of it at home and then it's reinforced in your music videos and in your video games and on your TV screens, where else are you going to learn nonviolence? This clip my group put together, my colleagues put together, often to show parents, it's in schools and that, what is media violence to them? And most parents think, you know, I've seen some of the kids' games that they play and they're not that bad. And this is not just to shock you, and I'm not going to play the whole thing, but some of it is that bad. And sometimes you have to take a look at it and say, what the heck is going on here?
Is this thing on? Oh, I thought this house was yang. Power to people. We living in that 31st century. Futuristic fly shit. The penthouse is the projects and everybody flies private. New watch knows how it is. Watch us. They can't stop us. The prophets be watching. No one man should have all that power. The clock's ticking. I just count the hours. Stop tripping. I'm tripping off the power. Rumble, young man, rumble. Life is a trip, so sometimes we gon' stumble. You gotta go through pain in order to become you. But once the world knows you, you'll feel like it's only one you. Now you got the power to do anything you want to. Until you ask yourself, is this what it's all come to? Looking at life through sunglasses in the sunroof. Until you have the power to get out from abundance. All these labels fuck what everybody wants from you. They tryna exorcise you. Welcome to the junction, to be continued. We on that Nolan Ellis shit, in search of the truth, even if it goes through Taylor Swift television. No one man should have all that power.
I think you get the message. And those of you who don't know it, if you are interested, there is a video game you can download for free on Columbine Massacre, so you can relive the entire thing yourself if you're 14 or 15 years old. At what point do you draw the line on some of these issues? So again, it's disturbing, and it doesn't come back to adolescents. Adolescents are not going to self-regulate these things because they're exciting and titillating to many of them. It comes down to us and as parents and as community members to recognize that these are a very powerful part of how kids learn to be violent. And it is very much in peer culture. We've developed resources for educators, if you're interested in it. Critical media literacy is becoming a bigger and bigger issue in high schools. So kids can learn to be critical of the media, to learn about it, not just reject it, because as you know, and we knew as teenagers, you can't just tell people not to do it or that it's bad for you. That makes it more interesting. You have to learn about what it is that might be harmful to you or other people, what's wrong about some of these messages, and be more critical in terms of discriminating and self-policing. It's the only solution for a lot of these issues. So let me leave that alone for a moment and move on to domestic violence exposure and the impact on child development in particular. This picture, which is on the cover of our new book, was taken at my colleague Peter Jaffe's house. Those are his little boys sitting there talking to the police officer. I thought I'd add that. We all like to get our kids in our books as much as possible. My daughter was on the front of the cover of the Abnormal Child Psychology textbook. She was only 3 at the time. Now she's a university student, and they've changed the cover, but they laugh about it. My other one's in the chapter on eating disorders, but she was in a crib at the time, or a high chair at the time, and it was more on disorderly eating than eating disorder. What is the impact on child development? Well, I like to look at the themes or the dimensions of child development that are affected, not just particular behaviors or something, but really the theme is typically emotion regulation and attachment. Because as I mentioned earlier, learning to communicate is emotional in the beginning until kids learn cognitive development in that. And the first thing they have to conquer is emotion regulation, and it takes many years. And that's taught by your parents, by your caregivers, by your home environment. That basically, as you get upset by something, you can regulate yourself, and people help you do that. As kids have a temper tantrum, you help them regulate it. You don't start yelling at them and hitting them. But what we see among abusive men is that one of the most strident characteristics is they don't know how to regulate. And they'll act like a 4-year-old and start kicking and screaming and yelling and having a temper tantrum, because they never learned how to do it. So these fundamental messages that we know about child development are repeated throughout their development in adolescence and well on to adulthood if they're not properly learned at some point along the way. They won't just suddenly happen. So often, some of them will have an insecure or disorganized attachment because attaching to a parent figure is too difficult, too uncertain. So if they approach, they may get punished, so they may avoid, and then they lose out, so they have more of a disorganized strategy. The reduced emotion regulation, inability to describe their inner state. Increased attention to threat, what we call victims and victimizers. They look at the world in terms of who's going to hurt me and who can I hurt, to be self-protective. That's what they've grown up with. That's how they've learned to relate to others. And this emotion regulation is so critical because if you don't learn how to regulate yourself, other people have to do it for you or you don't do it. So teachers have to do it, peers have to do it, parents have to do it, and you don't know how to do it yourself. And that regulation could be more violent and aggressive that you show, or it could be the opposite. It could be more withdrawn and socially inept and unable to relate to peers. A lot of the kids will have a negative sense of badness and self-blame and shame. And we see this not only in kids who witness violence, but of course kids who are sexually abused as well. This next page has a summary from Carlson, which I think is helpful if you're interested in some of these dimensions. It shows, whoops. The dimensions here on the left, behavioral, emotional, physical, cognitive, social, and it shows the different age groups here. And what I point out here is that you see a lot of similarity across ages. Let's look at emotional for a minute. You see that in preschoolers, you see fear and anxiety and sadness and worry and post-traumatic stress types of symptoms. And it continues on into school age. And by the time they're adolescent, you may see higher rates of depression and suicidal attempts and post-traumatic stress. So you see a sort of a consistent pattern across development, but the behaviors may actually change a little bit. It's just the pattern's the same. Problems with distress and self-regulation, for example, physically, and then the overactivity, demanding, and we see higher rates of substance abuse in adolescents. So these things, the characteristics may change as the child gets older, the way they express the distress, but the themes are very similar. Clinically, we see the kids have been exposed to domestic violence. They're showing failure to thrive and listlessness as in infancy, problems in their routines, developmental delays, difficulties with attachment and trust, aggression, clinging, cruelty, and so forth. Post-traumatic stress being sort of a conglomerate of a lot of these types of things. When children have gone through extremely traumatic events, unable to regulate, unable to deal with the overwhelming stress. Those are the younger kids. By elementary school, you see these types of outcomes. clinical outcomes or more significant outcomes for these kids. Bullying and aggression, depression, anxiety, oppositional behavior, and so forth. Then you start to see the attitudes creep in, disrespect, and sex role stereotypes. Guys do only these things, girls do only those things. That rigidity that perpetuates the myth in terms of sex role expectations. And then the pattern continues into adolescence. Dating violence. This is why I got involved in it, and I'm going to share with you how we deal with that issue in a little while. Because this is the next step. This is the next point where they're trying to learn their own relationships. Bullying, self-esteem, PTSD and truancy, somatic concerns, and the continued disrespect, alcohol, drug abuse. And you may see a sudden decline in their school achievement if they are still living in a domestic violence situation. And one of the themes throughout all of this, by the way, is that these effects are due to problems in relationships, and we can't forget that. These aren't just clinical signs or symptoms that come out of nowhere. They're problems in dealing with relationships because they haven't been exposed to healthy relationships. And in the absence of healthy relationships, they don't know how to relate very well. So they may bully. They may be aggressive with dating partners. They may abuse alcohol and drugs in order to fit in. To me, all of those things are signs of difficulties in the relationships, and the relationships are what we need to focus on for these kids. Here's what we know about resilience in these kids, which comes not only from the domestic violence literature, but the child clinical literature as well. A strong relationship with a competent and caring adult is the most critical outcome, or critical resilience factor. We've known that for many years. It's often apparent, but it doesn't have to be. Community safe havens. You'll often hear young adults, older teenagers, express how they made it through these situations and someone cared about them. A coach, a teacher, religious figure, a parent, someone, an aunt, an uncle, a sister. Someone recognized their needs and paid attention to it. Very critical, very simple. And the children themselves have certain characteristics that also increase the likelihood that they'll show resilience. Attention span, above average intelligence, and so forth. Economic stability and viability, and efforts at protection of these children, of course, all enhance resilience. These are the things that your community needs to focus on the most. We can't just get rid of violence without promoting the things that are nonviolent or that increase resilience in these children. You can't just make children resilient. You have to provide them with opportunities and educate everyone as to the importance of their role in reaching out to children that might need a competent, caring adult figure. So let me talk about prevention now. There's a lot of different points where we can intervene and still call it prevention. You can prevent something from occurring, or prevent it before it even occurs. We call those universal programs typically, and some are targeted for kids that are already showing or not already in a situation where they may be exposed to problems, such as kids in foster homes or something that may have higher needs but haven't done anything wrong yet. So prevention before it occurs. It's like fluoride in the water. Everybody gets it, and it reduces the overall incidence of the problem. Then you have the incidents occur, physical abuse and so forth, whatever these stressors might be. And then there's prevention of reoccurrence, which most of us are involved in, because now we've detected the problem. And this is sadly where in our societies we've always paid the most attention, and not to the other end up here. We wait till there's a cavity, we try to fill it, and I think dental health is a lot like mental health in that regard. You have to work earlier at it. We know what causes these things. It's not brushing your teeth in this case. So you can prevent the reoccurrence of it, or you can prevent impairment. So the children who have been exposed to this, you can help them recover from it. So these are all the different intervention points that we have, and there's many programs that go along with that. For example, universal programs, media awareness efforts, media campaigns promoting awareness of violence, helpful responses of neighbors, friends, co-workers in your communities, school-based and community agency awareness and skill development for kids, programs that teach positive relationship skills and alternative conflict resolution, gender roles, forming healthy, intimate relationships. And I'll talk about our 4th R in a moment, and Safe Dates is another one being used in the U.S. here. All of these are efforts at universal programming for kids, so everyone gets a little dose. Everyone gets some information about healthy relationships. It's not always enough for all the kids, but it certainly reduces overall incidence, or it should. Then there are numerous selected programs available nowadays, shelter programs for kids who've already shown at risk because of their family situation or their behaviors, or both. Child protection service programs. There's a big overlap between abuse and witnessing of violence, so often Child Protection Services offers groups for kids who have had one or both of these issues. Selected are for kids that are having some signs or may have problems if we don't help them now, right? And then there's the indicated, the kids that are already having difficulties. And this again is where most of the research has fallen in an effort to really show what works for whom. Not enough on the prevention side, but certainly at the reducing impairment. Psychotherapy with the parent and the child, trying to heal that relationship. Trauma-based cognitive behavior therapy, group therapies like the Kids Club, which Sandra Graham Berman, not far from here in Detroit, has been working on for many years, and that's very evidence-based. Acute trauma therapy, home visitation with women and children, and intervention programs for abusive fathers, such as Caring Dads, that was developed by a former graduate student of mine, Katrina Scott, working with dads who are interested in having a relationship with their child, but they have been an abuser of their spouse. And it's a dilemma. Kids want to have a relationship with their father, and the father has not been abusive towards the child, so the court may allow them visitations, but they need a lot more information, a lot more guidance if they're going to raise the child in any capacity. So those are our choices of interventions, if you will. They've been around in the last 5 or 10 years. I've been shocked at the amount of growth in this area in terms of children exposed to violence. It's probably outpacing child abuse and neglect at the moment. I haven't been at a conference, child abuse and neglect, with 400 people in the room in several years. So there's a lot more interest in this topic than I've ever seen in the past. Who knew 30 years ago, when we were looking at this issue, we thought it was kind of tangential to the mainstream issues of child abuse and neglect, and now we've all recognized that these things are so widespread and central. Now, before I talk about our program for a moment, I just want to point out some of the other things that your communities are doing, or should be doing, or could be doing. Nowadays, there's a lot more guidance available to us in terms of how to integrate our services in the community. Our crisis assessment intervention programs, refocusing existing services so that there's more attention paid to the children who may have witnessed violence. And this includes children's and adult mental health services, child protection, counseling, custody and access, juvenile justice, awareness and education, such as being at conferences like this to talk about it, to recognize it, that maybe we need to put a little bit more energy on that child in this situation, not just on the adults. Specialized services for the parents or the batterers, coordination with community services and justice, and lastly, the primary prevention or universal prevention in schools, which I'll now talk about. These are all the choices, if you will, that your community has, and you have to kind of divide up the attention and the time and the money amongst them. You have to decide for yourself, where do you want to put your energies? Because if you put it all in primary prevention, which I would advocate you do, but you'll get a lot of overall effects, but you'll still have incidents. And the difficulty with universal prevention is as soon as there's a reported case, people say prevention isn't working, and they go back to wanting to intervene again and wait till there's a crisis. And we have to fight that. We have to be aware of it here to say, you know, universal prevention means you reduce the disease. You can't get rid of it. So there still will be cases of HIV even though we're trying to prevent it among everybody, for example. You can't just treat it by finding victims. Most people understand that, but when it gets into the news that there was a dating violence incident at school, despite the fact they were trying to teach these new concepts, or issue of domestic violence that was very serious, even though your community is very on top of this issue. That's what we have to be aware of and be able to have the right responses to, we continue to do. On the other hand, if you put it all into assessment and intervention and such, you'll find yourself overworked and you'll never be able to stop the floodgates. So it is a balance. Let me now talk about what we can be doing in our schools to promote healthy nonviolent relationships among youth. In 1989, we had a, here I go back again in my year. In 1989, we had a conference, and we were focusing on preventing child abuse and neglect in Toronto. And everyone agreed that the most critical point was pre-postnatal. And David Old's program on the nurse home practitioner was just sort of underway back then. And everyone said, if you really help the parents expect that child, be prepared for the child, and so forth, they will love the child and not harm the child. The other opportunity that people began to recognize, because you can't always catch them at that point, was early adolescence. The reason for this is that in the pre and postnatal period, the relationship's brand new, people are curious, they're interested, they're devoted, their attention's focused, and with a little bit of guidance and help, you can divert a lot of bad stuff that goes on at home. You can help people be a better parent, absolutely. And that's now been shown with David Old's work. The same thing can occur in early adolescence, because their job in early adolescence is to leave the family, not attach, but to detach. They get more attached with their peer group. They're engaged in wanting to become like their peers. They're curious. They have new relationships. They want to date. They want sex. They want violence. They want drugs. They want all these things, adult privileges, so to speak, and they need guidance. So I started the youth relationships back in 1990 after that meeting, and I said, you know, let's work with these kids who've grown up in violent homes, in protective services, and help them forge better relationships. Let's change the tide right then. The first group we had was just boys, because I thought, you know, that no one was really paying enough attention to adolescent boys and trying to teach them about these things. And it was really a pilot group to find out from them, what do we need to be doing to help you? And they said, bring girls to the group. And I kid you not, and they were right, because they were talking about relationships and they wanted the opinions of the opposite sex. But it turned out to be good advice. So we started with small groups of 8 to 10 kids, all who grew up in violent homes, witnessed or were abused themselves. They were voluntary. They had done nothing wrong. They were 14 to 16 years old, and they wanted to learn about healthy relationships. And this was more of a growth group. It wasn't deficit-based. They were not there because of something they lacked. We appealed to their curiosity and to the positive sides of what they wanted to learn. And because of that, I think it was quite successful. And we published that if you're interested in it. But what we did was we taught the kids about what a healthy relationship was, how do you solve conflict, what is wrong about violence, all these types of issues. Well, that grew into the 4th R program we started about 9-10 years ago now. 4th R stands for relationships, reading, writing, arithmetic, and relationships. And we wanted to take our youth relationships and make it available to every kid, not just kids with high-risk circumstances in their families, to really do the fluoride in the water, to make it sustainable for every child to learn about a relationship. We hired a fellow who was the head of our Safe Schools program at our school board to help us do this, and he's still with us today, Ray Hughes, to really teach us how do we do this in a teaching environment so it's taught by teachers so we don't have to go in and sustain it, so it's something everybody gets as part of their normal curriculum. And lo and behold, in 2001, pardon me, province of Ontario had required that kids in grade 9 health class learn about sex, drugs, and violence. But the way it was being taught was the way it was taught to most of us. Don't do it, stay away from it, you'll get in trouble. Teachers had no background in it. In fact, the very first year it was offered, before I even knew it was being offered, my son was in grade 9. He was 14. And he came home from school, I'll never forget, it was early in the year. He was sitting there talking on the phone, typing on the computer, watching television, and told me he was doing his homework. And then he turns to me, he says, "Dad, what's sexual harassment?" And I said, "Alex, what did you do at school today?" He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, why do you have to know what that is? Who told you?" He said, my coach told me to go home and ask my parents what it was." I said, "Why would he do that if you didn't do something wrong?" He had no idea what it was. Anyway, that was their lesson, because they had no lesson plan. Go home and ask your parents what sexual harassment is. So, when I found out that actually they were supposed to be learning this stuff, I was very curious. So we found out it's in the lesson plan, but they don't know how to teach it. There's no curriculum, there's no book. And so we wrote the 4th R. And my son now knows what sexual harassment is. He's 24, he should. So what happened at that point is we started introducing it into the schools and made it so it's available to all kids in grade 9. Remember, health class and phys ed in your state as well as our provinces is a requirement. It's either in grade 9 or grade 10. You have to take these courses. The problem is that it's not highly monitored, because parents don't really care what grades your kids get in this course. Principals don't follow it because it's not part of your grade 10 outcome measures and all that. So you're fighting an uphill battle in that regard, but at least it's being taught by teachers. The key principles, based on what we've been talking about today, is that child neglect and abuse are relationship problems. And the causes stem from childhood and the relationships that they've learned to form. So if you're going to prevent these issues, you need to focus on relationships. Violence doesn't affect everyone equally. Women and minorities tend to be affected much more in terms of the significance of it. Recognize violence in relationships as part of societal violence. You can't separate it from media violence and the other issues. It's all part of what kids are being exposed to and learning. Relationships are dynamic. They can be adjusted. You don't have a kid with a ticking time bomb. You have a child who's curious about learning other things, often wants to relate to other people in a different way, but doesn't know how. And so they'll look at victims and victimizers instead. Healthy relationships are protective. Kids who know what a good relationship is won't tend to try to only have the bad ones, only force the bad ones on others. All teens need accurate information and exposure to positive models. And this is, to me, a central aspect of universal prevention. You don't go out and say, okay, will the Raptor kids please stay after class? You're going to have a special little group today because you've been selected. Those programs don't work very well for bullying and anti-violence and substance abuse and so forth, because everybody's affected. And just like in bullying program, what works best is to teach everybody what to do, not just kids who might be bullies or might be victims. When everybody knows, someone will stand up and do something about it. Someone will start moving it in the other direction. That's the whole principle behind this. You have to practice skills. You can't get away with it. You can't talk about relationships and problem solving and conflict resolution without skill practice with kids. It's like trying to teach math by just talking about it without practicing it. It's like trying to teach basketball from a book. You can't do that. So relationships, the teacher has to get in there and teach it and use dynamic methods with the kids. And they were not doing that. They were just discussing it prior to that. So let me just show you this and be on our way. The fourth R was developed to help youth strengthen relationship skills, to make safe, responsible choices. Very straightforward. A lot of parents would say, well, aren't they already learning that in school? Well, actually, no. They're not, unless they're being taught this. To address the common elements of risk behaviors, what we call the goals of adolescence. Trying to fit in, trying to get ahead, trying to make friends, trying to have a dating partner, all these types of things, trying to have adult privileges. Those are their goals. It's trying to help them do that, but pace it, make it realistic, so that they don't do it too quickly. Counteract some of the pro-abuse messages that you've been hearing about, typically on gender, race, and sexual orientation. This is the world they live in. Everything's gay. Teasing people about anything that's different about them. It's, I can get into that in another talk, but it's, they go back to a very rigid view of their world like they had when they were little, when it made sense to make things very simple. And when they get into grades 7, 8, 9, things are confusing again, they try to simplify it, okay? And they simplify it based on your hair color, your skin color, your sex, your shoes, your tie, not your tie. Where did I come up with that one? Anything that's different about you is potential for discrimination. And by forming groups together, you know, or gangs or what have you, that gives you some protection from that. So that's all what they're going through at this point. We have to counteract some of that, relax some of that rigidity in them and help them understand that the differences are a good thing. Emphasize positive messages of safety and harm reduction, or prepare them and not scare them. Scaring kids around these things has never worked. In my generation, it was the prom scenes of the cars wrapped around trees, and that, you know, that really stopped you from drinking and driving. Not the ones that were at risk, the kids that were at risk. That only titillated them. They laughed about it. They need more than that. And provide opportunities for kids to develop their assets. Make them part of the solution. Aim for programs for kids that engage them, not aim at them. Don't tell them they're the problem, tell them they're solutions. So that's what schools offer, because everyone's getting it, no one's being identified, no one's targeted, everyone's part of this, and you're part of the solution because you're a kid, and we want to hear from you. So what we do, this is just a sample of the lessons in the personal safety and injury prevention. In Ontario, all the provinces in Canada, all the states in the US, we've looked at all the national education guidelines. These lessons are in there. They're not listed like this because they're just guidelines. We fit our lessons to the guidelines, so if a teacher's teaching it, he or she is fulfilling the requirements. You're supposed to learn about facts and myths about relationships or healthy relationships, barriers, contributors to violence, conflict and conflict resolution. For example, they're supposed to learn what is passive and assertive and aggressive in school. Media violence, some states don't have that and some do. Conflict resolution skills, and what we call action in the school and community, where kids participate in making their school safer or their community safer. That's not a requirement, that's something we stuck in there. And that's just the one on personal safety. There's also 7 on substance use and 7 on blah, 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 blah. My mind went blank. Okay, when you do that. Relationships, it'll come to me. So let me show you a video now of boys in the classroom. In our grade 9 classes, they're segregated into male-female because it's gym class. Not all schools do that, but a lot of them do in 9th grade. And a lot of people ask us, how do you get boys to talk about these things? It's not that difficult if you teach it much like you would coaching a skill for these kids. So, oh, by the way, it was sex. That's the other one. How could I forget that? Healthy sexuality, substance use, personal safety. Drugs are wearing off, I guess, here, Dave. So let me show you a clip of we taped all the classes. This is about 5 years ago when we were developing the program before we evaluated it. So these are based on real classes. Videographer was there all day, every hour of every class. There's 21 classes. So they got used to this person taking their picture. And so these were not staged or anything.
Fuzzy, isn't it? You have two sort of different types of things. One is you have the headings of the 5 different types of violence or abuse. What I want you to do in just a minute, you are going to take those headings and you're going to tape them on the top of your section of board. Then what I want you to do is read each scenario in your group, read them together, and decide which heading, which type of violence it is, and tape it underneath the heading on the board. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes, and then we'll discuss. Okay, gentlemen, one of the first things I want you to do, some of you have already done, is take a look around the room at each group's headings, how many they have underneath each heading. And it'll be hard to see. Some of you will be able to see actually which ones they put under each heading. First thing I notice, what do you guys notice? Let's see, emotions.
It's all different.
Yeah, they're all different, aren't they? Different numbers under each heading, and I'm sure if we look close at some people would have something.
So that was just part of the didactic part of it, getting some of the basics down with the kids. But a simple lesson around what is violence is where you actually have to start, because a lot of them will start arguing about whether or not what they did was a violent thing or not. This next one, the next short clip, is on active listening skills. You'll see the girls' class, and then it'll switch over to the boys' class. And this is a bit more active. Getting girls to listen and talk. Not that tough.
Okay, so listen carefully. There are 3 different roles within your groups. Everyone is going to get the chance to participate in each role. So even though you may not do it first, at some point, when we switch, you will get the opportunity to play that role. Right? Within your group of 3, one of you is going to be the speaker. Okay, one of you will speak, and you're going to speak about a topic. I'm going to tell you what the 2 topics are. You're going to speak about the topic for 1 minute only. So if you don't have a watch on, you can use the clock up there. But, and I will time as well, I will say start, and that person will talk about the topic for 1 minute, and at the end of the minute I will say stop. The second person in your group is going to be the listener. And they are going to get a chance to practice their active listening.
Hey, stop. Tell it again. See, you're getting a lot better. Remember, I'm not arguing on this. It doesn't have to be a true story. Guys, you can just listen up. We're focusing But still, that's showing you're distracted. You're focusing on something else. So please be aware, even though you think you got the basics, many of you did, you're good as far as looking at the person, face them, take away other distractions.
She's a wonderful talker, but she doesn't listen well. Okay.
In some ways, very basic skills, obviously, but how many of you learned those when you were growing up as an adolescent? And maybe had to learn them later on in your marriage, but it's not being facetious, but it's a fundamental skill if kids are going to learn how to actually relate to one another. But the thing is, they have to do it in a way that they're comfortable with it. There is no one recipe for that. The male teacher here is a coach. He uses his hands a lot. He engages the kids. I think it's just good classroom methods to get these kids engaged in this issue. So I like to say, if they don't enjoy their health class more than math and English, you're doing something wrong. It should be fun for them to come in and learn about these topics. It's very relevant for them. If you're interested in the results of this, it was published 2 years ago in Archives of Pediatrics and Adolescent Development, Adolescent Medicine, and I'd be happy to give you the information on that. What we're doing now is we have the program in over 1,500 schools in Canada. We have several sites in the U.S. We're trying out, the Bronx being our largest right now, so that it can be adapted in different ways. The idea, as well, is that a program like this is the basics, but communities adapt it to fit better. The first thing that the Bronx did is they changed hockey into basketball. A simple little thing, but let's face it, I mean, that's what the kids talk about. So there's fundamental aspects that we ask people to modify for your community to make it fit. There's also lots of videos that go with it, which are made by youth, and we encourage the school districts to make their own, because it's not that difficult, and it's much better if you have your own kids in the videos that look like your kids and act like your kids and don't look like Canadian kids, even though I don't think there's any difference in them. So that's my major lesson here. I want to leave you with one last thought here, that this is a little public service announcement that the Futures Without Violence developed. Some of you may have seen. They're coming out with all sorts of excellent community-wide announcements to get people just to think.
Excuse me, I've been getting mixed messages about women and violence. I need a little clarification. I'm supposed to grow up to respect women. Why not have such lousy role models? Can you help me reshape my attitudes towards women?
Okay. That's our book that's coming out, or just came out, and if you're interested in more information, that's our website and so forth. Thank you very much, and all the best with your plans here.
Thanks, David, very much. I just wanted to point out to everybody, in your book is, I think, a bright green half sheet of paper, and on that half sheet is a link to a website where all of this will be posted. So we'll have it available for everybody, including the video that we're making of the plenaries as well. So the materials will be up, the videos will be up, we'll be all set.
Well, I'm very happy to be here. I'm from Ohio. How many of you are from Ohio? Right. How are the Indians doing this year? Better than expected. Well, they could certainly beat the New Orleans professional baseball team, since we don't have one. Well, I'm very happy to be here, and we've been talking so far this afternoon about children. This is very important. How many of you work with children? Raise your hand. Keep your hands up. You've been working with children your first year that you're working with traumatized people or children. Raise your hand. Could we give them a hand, please? Unfortunately, there's only like 6 people that raised their hand. There's a lot of gray hair in here, so I'm not sure how we're going to work on that. How many of you have been at this job maybe 1 to 5 years? Raise your hand. Great, in terms of working with traumatized children. How about 5 to 10 years? Good. How about 10 to 15 years? Great. How about 15 to 20? Great, about the same. Interesting. How about 20 to 25? Keep them up. Good. All right, here we go. These are the veterans, definitely. I mean, I would say 25 years is a veteran, but how about 25 to 30? I know, I keep going. These are the veterans, and these are the ones that we really should be applauding. Let's just say between 30 and more. Raise your hand. Keep your hands up. Give them your veterans an applause. You all probably don't need this lecture. You all could teach us a thing or two with regard to surviving this work, of thriving in this work. How many of you believe that you're just barely surviving in terms of the work? Raise your hand. How many of you feel that you're resilient in terms of this work? Wonderful. That's great. That's good to hear. All right, well, what I'm here to do, in effect, is to focus on you. We're not going to be talking about children, but we're going to be talking about the people who take care of children, especially professionals who take care of children. So this is what I want to do. I first of all want you to take a deep breath. Good. Yeah, good. Let it out. Yes. That's good. Because this session is for you. If I could wave a magic wand and enable all of you to feel significantly happier and more optimistic and hopeful, I would do it in a heartbeat. But I don't know about you, but so far I feel fairly depressed with regard to the circumstances here, because it's reality. How many of you know about the reality firsthand? Raise your hand. How many of you, when you were hearing Dave's lecture, that you thought about specific children? Raise your hand. Yeah. Because they don't go away. We end up thinking about these children all the time, including our sleep. How many of you have had nightmares associated with your work? Raise your hand. How many of you have gone to work and haven't really been all that rested because of the lack of effective sleep? Raise your hand. How many of you feel stress on a regular basis at work? Raise your hand. How many of you work with people who love you and care about you? Yeah. People that love and care about you at work, raise your hand. That's great. How many of you laugh too much? All right, I want you to point to the people that make you laugh, please. Point to the people that make you laugh. I'm noticing there are some people that are pointing to themselves. All right, could I just do me a favor, please? The people that had at least 4 people pointing at them, could you stand up, please? Could you please stand up? Those of you that pointed at you, give them a hand. Because that keeps us going, doesn't it? Because you got to laugh. And it's very interesting. I've been studying military, police officers, firefighters, nurses, and social workers. They have a very warped sense of humor, people. very weird, but it keeps them going. It enables them to survive this very, very difficult work. We started this research, the first research project that I involved they were involved in my first research project of focusing on compassion fatigue. We went to the local regional hospital in Tallahassee, and we interviewed critical care nurses focusing on the pediatric wards in children and adolescents. And our question was, how do you do it? How do you do it? Because one of my doctoral students, his child of, I think, about 6 or so, got hit by a car, and they spent a lot of time in that hospital and a lot of time around these nurses, and they were wonderful. And I'm sure you feel the same way about the services here and the people that are wonderful here. But the whole point is, how in the world do you, those of you who raised your hand, have been doing this for a long time, how do you do it? Could someone just yell out from the back of the room or anywhere, what sustains you?
Prayer, prayer, prayer.
Raise your hand if it's prayer. Good. Not to say that that's not important, but anything else? Okay, I didn't hear that, but keep going. What? Exercise. Raise your hand if you have exercise. Is that you, Abby, from North Carolina and Fort Worth? Now that's the New Orleans tradition right there. Any other substances? The point is, we do what we need to do, right, to get through the day. We try to reframe things. We try to take deep breaths. We try to blame Republicans. It works for me frequently, actually, especially Rick Perry. God bless Rick Perry. Someone I really cannot like easily without any kinds of problems, no ambivalence at all. Anyway, sorry about that. All right, let me get back to this. So I want to focus on, what do you do in the trenches? What do you do when you don't work with workers who care about you? Colleagues that care about. What do you do about a supervisor that's insensitive and doesn't really quite get why you're so tired all the time? Having to go to very difficult neighborhoods and challenging neighborhoods. Having to work through, how many people like paperwork? Raise your hand. Exactly. Is that a source of stress for anybody? No. Oh, good. Great. I found a city in the world. There's not like that. So what I want to do, first of all, is what were your adversities that affect the quality of life in human services. So what are the things that pull you down? What are the things that are adversities to the extent that it's a barrier to you? It makes your work toxic. What are those things? What's that? Funding sources. Bureaucracy. Paperwork. Anything else? Chronic exposure to highly stressful events that make it very toxic for you. Good answer, thank you. I'll pay you a little later. But the adversities are everywhere and all the time, and definitely all of these things wear you down. But to see a child who's suffering and know that that child will go back to the same context, how does that feel? The interesting thing is how many of you have stuck with this work. How many of you have, despite all these difficulties, stayed with it? And I'm suggesting that most people in this room are resilient. Now, on your chair, you've found a couple of measures. It's because of me, and I'm going to be talking about those a little bit later. But it's a way for you to sort of get a sense of your level of resilience. And don't fill them out yet now, please. Fill them out later, and feel free to make copies. My understanding is that this presentation, as well as those handouts, will be available to you. All right, so I'm going to share with you a roadmap, a couple of models that I've found to be useful. They're all evidence-based. They've actually guided a number of my doctoral students and other people through this program of research focusing on secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, the things that affect us, the work that we have to do, that we do in terms of caring for other people. Because caring hurts. Caring brings a price. And frequently the people that go into this work, including Dave and I and a lot of you that I've met here, do it because we're really caring and compassionate people. It draws us, it attracts us there, and it holds on to us. But it comes at a price. And so what I'm hoping to share with you in this next hour or so is the roadmap and some strategies for being able to deal with all of the adversities that you confront every single day. So I'm going to focus on these building blocks that are really associated with your own human development. Because we can focus on putting out fires and eliminating symptoms and things like that. But you, as a human being, as an individual person who's selected this career, we need to be concerned about your own human development, where you are in your life, apart from your work, or at least in addition to your work. And that I'll share with you here, the suggestion is that the level of thriving is the level of human development, and the thriving level is associated with how you learn, how you process information, and how you deal with these kinds of adversities on a regular basis, whether you do it strength-based or fear-based, whether you're doing it in order to improve yourself and the people that you work with, or trying to duck and avoid all the horrible negative things that are in this world, even in your career. So thriving as a human service professional means displaying indicators of life satisfaction, of effectiveness in critical life roles, and it's clearly correlated with human development. So these are the building blocks. Thriving, resilience. I defined those already. You can read those. They're fairly straightforward. There's two categories of resilience I'm going to share with you that I think is very important. And that is trait resilience and state resilience. Trait resilience is what you were born with. And so I'll talk about these in a few minutes. But these are the elements of thriving in human development. And then resilience and learning are spectrum variables. There is a range. It's not like you reach a particular number and then suddenly you're in another category. It's a very much a spectrum issue. And this is what I'm talking about here. We have human development, what we're all hoping to move toward, and that we're at a sufficiently high level. But let me start over here on the left side in terms of trait resilience. How many of you know of people that you've known them from childhood and that they seem to be resilient, and you could tell even from childhood? Raise your hand if you know friends or people like that. Yeah, and they come to the situation with a certain degree of sets of skills, orientations, abilities, mood, that enable them to be able generally to deal with any kind of situation. And there's another type of state resilience, and I'll define this in a second, and again, you'll have it in your handout when you go online. State resilience is essentially trying to manage the current situation, whatever you're dealing with. And then all of us obviously do very well in some situations and not necessarily in others. But what we're focusing on right here is your work as a professional trying to protect children or provide services for them and their families. So state resilience is extraordinarily important because that's the sorts of things that are needed that we're trying to develop in the children that Dave showed us earlier. It's your ability to manage that kind of situation. And I'll share with you later that some of these state resilience can be trained and developed, and we'll talk about that in a second. But more importantly, it feeds directly into self-care. Because to be resilient, obviously, you need to focus on your own needs and your own services. How many of you have taken a vacation in the last year? Raise your hand. How many people did not raise their hand? And how many people are not raising their hand now? Okay. There's a huge number of people that did not raise their hand. That's part of self-care. What do you do for your own self-care, by the way? Because we talked about exercise, right? Alcohol, what else? What else? Spend time with healthy kids. In other words, the opposite of the kids that you work with. How many of you have self-care? Specifically, you choose to play with your pets? Raise your hand. Yeah, I'm trying to help you out. What else? What other self-care? Because what I want you to do, those of you, raise your hand if you've been at this work more than 25 years again. Please, those of you who are just raising your hand, how have you done this? What are the things that sustain you? Gardening, good. Raise your hand if you garden. Every time I mention these kinds of self-care, I want you to raise your hand. Good. What else? Reading. What else? Okay, yeah, so your self-care isn't as hard because you work for an organization that cares for you too, in addition to yourself. Good, what else? How many work in an organization which that organization cares for you as much as yourself? Raise your hand. 4, 5, 6, 7. What else? Dating? Singing. The arts, singing, good. All of these are associated with your own pleasures. We're still going. Okay, keep going. This is great.
Traveling.
Crafts, good. All right, well, come back to me now after you're comparing notes in your self-care. You're saying, yeah, I go boating. They say, oh, where do you go boating? Well, wait for that conversation. We're going to have a break soon. So self-care, if you go to the greencross.org or Figley Institute or mine, charlesfigley.com, you will find lots and lots of work, lots and lots of strategies, measures, protocols, all that sort of thing associated with self-care. So it's extraordinarily important. That is a direct relationship then to thriving. And thriving, high thriving, again, strength-based learning is what I'd indicated before. So it's the notion of you're pretty much in your stride. You have a general sense of what's going on. You have a general sense of what affects you, how you're able to take care of yourself. For example, how many of you are able to go back to sleep when you wake up fairly easily? Raise your hand. How many people have the opposite effect, that you have difficulty getting back to sleep? Okay. Because obviously when you come in and you're not as alert, you're more tired, that's a challenge as well. So the notion of strength-based learning, in effect, is to reinforce, to continue to push forward those kinds of skills and sensitivities and self-talk that you already have, in contrast to those who are just getting by, those who dread to go to work, those who are anticipating being traumatized again, those who anticipate being depressed as a result of the work. So what happens is that they protect themselves. They begin and develop a strategy for being able to minimize the amount of difficulties that they approach. They steel themselves, they protect themselves, they keep their head down, and they're able to get through the day. What an existence. What an existence. So my hope is that along this process, as I share with you some of my thoughts and that you compare notes and share with other people, that you will be high thriving, that will move toward that, because it's not a great life in which you have low thriving. So this is what I mean: trait resilience, emotional optimism for those who have high trait resilience, openness to new experiences, new restaurants, new foods, for example, go to vacation, places you've never gone before, and general life satisfaction. And life satisfaction really is associated with the use of more positive emotions and fewer negative emotions compared to people on the opposite end. Emotional flexibility then is the primary component, and it is high self-regulation efficiency. The ability to notice when you have stress, where it is, being able to decrease that stress as an example. State resilience then is the actions both learned and inherited that effectively manage adversity. So it is trait resilience plus state resilience. So in other words, it's inherited and learned that effectively manage adversity. So all the things that you have to deal with on a regular basis, you're able to effectively manage. It may not be immediate, Remember that your first year out of your graduate program in which you were then thrown into a new job and had to learn that? Raise your hand if you remember that very well. Kind of scary. It took a while to adapt, but eventually you did. So it's that kind of figuring out all that's going on and then being able to do something about that. So what I want to share with you now are these 10 factors associated with state resilience, which hopefully you're able to see you're either doing something or much of this correctly to the extent that it enables you to feel better and you feel refreshed when you come back, and maybe some strategies for doing something about that. Now again, we're moving toward state resilience, but we also have to start over here because the main active ingredient with regard to working with traumatized children is essentially the empathic response. How many people have no idea what I'm talking about in terms of empathic response? Oh, good. Okay, great. Good. Can I have some waters? Can someone provide me some water? I'm getting... Thank you. How many know of people who have no empathic ability at all? As far as you can tell, there's not even an ounce of empathic ability inside. Keep your hands up if they're practitioners. That's not good. Okay. Well, that's a problem, and obviously they may have a case of compassion fatigue or something that maybe at one time they were compassionate and had this empathic ability, but now they behave in a way that is not that empathic. The empathic response is absolutely critical because it is able to read a person, have a sense of their feelings at the time, and that information then enables us to make fine-tuned distinctions and decisions with regard to whatever protocol that we're finding. But the main thing is that we're connecting with that client. The whole notion of therapeutic alliance is extraordinarily important and useful, and that's what this empathic response is all about. So right in the heart of our delivering the services is this extraordinarily important element, but we can't get there unless we have this empathic ability. Because if we don't have the empathic ability, what do we draw upon? How do we make distinctions and decisions related to that? But in order to have the empathic ability, empathic response, you need empathic ability. But in addition to that, you have to care. Have any of you been to a cocktail party or some other beer fest or whatever you like? Oktoberfest is coming up soon, so here's another example. In which the person recognizes that you're a therapist. Raise your hand if you've been in situations in which they know that you're a professional, mental health professional. Okay, so you're not telling anybody. Is that what I'm hearing? Very good idea. Very good idea. But then, and even if they don't know you, how many times have you had the occasion of providing services or at least a kind thoughts or discussing something, helping another person? Maybe when you're standing in line for a bus and you say to yourself, nah, I'm not working. I don't care enough to talk to this person. Raise your hand here, a little self-care here, please. Okay. But we have to have motivation in order to work with people. And for these children, some of whom are dangerous, there's every incentive in the world to avoid that, right? So the first thing, in order to be able to provide empathic ability, is you have to know something about them, that you have a level of interest that you're actually exposed to. How many of you have been a practitioner and now you're a supervisor and you're not really working with clients anymore? Raise your hand. Okay, there's some people that have moved in that particular direction. For those people, they don't have to be empathic necessarily toward clients or children, but they certainly need to be empathic toward, their supervisees. So all of this then is associated with one's level of empathic response, which is extraordinarily important. Thank you. Now, this empathic response, though, comes with a cost to carry, a cost to empathy. And that is when you attend to this child or any other client that you're working with, parents, they create fingerprints on our hearts. In order to be able to help and understand them, we need to see the world from their perspective. And if their world is violent, discouraging, scary, sad, hopeless, we sometimes feel that way too, because how can you help someone unless you really understand them and understand their context? And to fully understand their context affects us. Now you could say, well, we can deliver the service and then everything is fine. Well, I think that's great if we can do that. But our research suggests that it's fairly difficult to do that, especially if we're compassionate and empathic and care about other people. So what happens here then is the stress of being compassionate, the demand to be compassionate, the need to be compassionate, the motivation to be compassionate is there. And as that increases, the state resilience level decreases and compassion fatigue increases. Because client after client, day after day, just like sediment in the river out here, it gets higher and higher and higher. And unless there's strategies, and I learned about the strategies right here in Cleveland, it's going to be really a problem eventually. There are two main things in terms of self-care, at least, that are important here. The first is a sense of satisfaction for the work, because it takes the sting out. It enables us to be able to get through the day. It enables us to get our hopes up again every morning. How many of you, as you work with these kids, again, raise your hand if you work with traumatized people, whether it be kids or parents, raise your hand high. Yeah, I know, because it's kind of sad. And all right, good. How many of you feel that in working with these children and these traumatized people, that you feel honored, that they trust your professional judgment, and that they have hope as a result of working with it? How many of you feel good about that? Raise your hand. The sense of privilege, and how fortunate we are to go home to our family and to our home and be able to put that behind us, at least for a while, right? But the fundamental thing is that this is extraordinarily important work, and that we're part of that work, and we're proud of being in that work. Raise your hand if you feel proud of being in that work. Because God knows there's horrific and terrible things that we see on a regular basis, but we have to recognize the fact that it gives us satisfaction. That as other people can turn their head away from these issues, we are not, and we aren't, and we will not turn our head away. So there is a sense of satisfaction, a sense of honor in this profession, even though we would like to get more money and more respect and a bigger office, right? But that we're doing something that's meaningful. And it's very interesting how one of the primary sources of stress management is what? Is prayer. Because that is a connection that enables us to reinforce, to feel comfort, to feel that we are on the right track. Because we can't do it by ourselves, right? So in putting your hand in the hand of the hand that stills the water, as they say, depending on your particular religion, that lightens the load for us. But one of the main things, though, is this sense of satisfaction in the work that we're doing. We can't let go of that. We need to be proud of that. It has to be reinforced all the time. And if a caring, sensitive employee, organization, agency, whatever, if it's truly a caring organization, they will reinforce that all the time in terms of what our mission is. It certainly came out here already. We're in a very elite group of people who work very hard with very, very sad cases, and that no one really understands how hard this is. So we have to yell to the rooftop that this is important work, and that we would welcome other new professionals into it. The final thing, of course, is, the other element that reduces the impact of the empathic response to self-care, and we've talked about that to a certain extent, But you know, it's interesting. A lot of people think of self-care as after you leave work. There was a colleague of mine who was in an audience fairly about this size in Gainesville, Florida. And there were people that work with, in University of Florida, is Shands Medical Center. And it focuses primarily on treating children. And a woman was a nurse indicated that until she figured this strategy out, she was depressed every single time she drove home. She thought about those kids the entire way home. She could not let it go. And then it occurred to her, you know, I'm going to imagine these kids as rag dolls. And that as I go home, it's her words, I rolled down the window and I flew and I imagined myself throwing the rag dolls out. Because I can't deal with it now. I want to attend to my own children and to my animals and to my husband and to my garden. I can't deal with it because when I come back to work, I then imagine rolling down the window and collecting them again in the car and focusing on what their needs are for the day. She had the courage to say, no, I'm going to take care of myself on the off hours. And that's terrific. And whatever strategy you can get in order to be able to let that go for a time and then attend to yourself would be great. But what about the self-care at the office? What about the self-care between clients? There are numbers of people that imagine themselves drinking water and imagining that they're cleansing themselves from this. How many of you have strategies for being able to manage the in vivo, at work kinds of stress between clients or during the day? Raise your hand. That's wonderful. Far fewer than the ones that raised their hand before in terms of the off hours. I urge you, please, at the break, to talk to other people about strategies they use during that time. There are a whole plethora of strategies, and I've talked about them in my Treating Compassion Fatigue book, 2002, but there are all kinds of many additional ones, and specifically for Cleveland, and because you may know these people or you may establish a good relationship, I hope that you'll share and try to figure that out. But we're not finished yet, because we have the exposure to trauma and trait resilience, because we know trait resilience feeds right in, so we really have to talk about that very much. But trauma exposure, it's highly likely that at some point, if you have not dealt with your trauma in the past, your childhood trauma or even your adult trauma, it's highly likely that you will remember them with certain clients. That those certain clients will definitely remind you of your experiences and your life, in effect. And instead of focusing exclusively on them, you will start focusing on yourself. And yes, of course, self-disclosure and being able to join with the client is extraordinarily important. But if it's getting in your way, if those traumatic experiences are affecting the way you're able to conceptualize a case, be able to effectively and objectively evaluate cases, then that's a problem that I hope you will address in supervision or whatever resources that you have. Because when they come up, it's important to make note of that and to do something about it. So you can clear your mind, if you will, of all the things that are important at the time, which most often is associated with clinical care. So that's what we're talking about here. Now, so we talked already about trait resilience and state resilience. Let's talk about self-care, at least generally. Oh, wait, look at my time. Good. Self-care. Self-care includes self-compassion. How many of you feel that you have compassion toward yourself? Raise your hand. How many people feel that you think of yourself, unfortunately, maybe last when you're working? Self-compassion, I helped edit a special issue in Clinical Social Work journal. And what developed from, among other things, what we introduced in that special issue, I think it was fall 2007, was this notion of empathic discernment. It's very much associated with compassion. We have to be discerning as service providers, right? We have to figure out what our clients need and then deliver those services to our clients. Well, that's good, because we have to make fine-tuned decisions all the time. Do we do that with ourselves? I don't think so. At least the research suggests that we don't. And that we're going along, focusing on that particular client, ignoring everything else, which in some ways is good. But yet, we're working beyond the time we were supposed to. We have not taken a lunch break yet. We have not even taken a break for the last 4 hours or so. That's not being compassionate. Yes, well, I had to do this for my clients. If you do this all the time, then that suggests to you that you do not have sufficient compassion for yourself. You are not practicing empathic discernment. Self-regulation, I think we talked about that a little bit. How many of you know exactly where you store stress? Raise your hand exactly where, okay, just yell out the spots so everyone else will think, oh yeah. I love this, it's a chorus. Okay, over here, what would be one example? Neck, okay, how many of you feel stress in your neck? Okay, what else? All right, I got shoulders here. Shoulders. All right. What else? Head. Raise your hand, head. Stomach. Knees and toes. Stomach. Both my daughters whenever they get nervous, they feel queasy. What else? Neck. I think we got neck, but go ahead. Neck. Back, sorry. How many feel stress in your back? All right, good. I mean, not good, but you know what I'm saying. If you're able to do that, that's good. Because any kind of strategy to reduce your stress, you know where to look. Right? So that's very important in terms of self-care. You need to know what to do about it, and hopefully you do know how to do about it. But what about the sense of, when do you figure out that you're upset? Is it that other people tell you this? You observe yourself behaving in that way, or you begin thinking about it? How many people think about it first before they move? Very good. So that's a very good sign of self-regulation, being able to know the circumstances and how to adapt and adjust yourself in that regard. Planning. How many people plan, maybe not obsessively, but you plan sufficiently? Raise your hand. Again, self-regulation is very important in terms of timing. Planning is very important. Be able to think it through, lists and all that sort of thing. How many of you feel that you have discipline? Okay, wait, let me just say discipline in terms of eating. Raise your hand. You were just talking about that at lunch. Again, there's a lot of people not raising their hand. Self-discipline, control. I lost control in contrast to being in control. Those things are very important in terms of self-care. And then, as I said before, empathic discernment. Of having empathy for yourself in order to be able to do something about that, to change your behavior in time. Now, the secondary title of this is put the mask on yourself first, right? It's something that is very, very fundamental, that somehow we kind of lose our way. I was going to say next slide. That wouldn't work. Okay, so again, we're at that same human development slide. We're now focusing on thriving. Thriving associated with human development level. Again, high correlation. Learning style, I think I've already mentioned this in effect. Strength-based versus fear-based. If we're treading water, if we're not sure of what's going on, if we don't have all those things working on us, then it's fear-based learning. Adversity of trauma. I'm going to share with you a model that emerged in the last couple of years. It's now working its way into at least a chapter now and several articles following it. It was initially our attempt to figure out how we can avoid and prevent post-traumatic stress disorder. And what we were able to figure out and how we essentially invented, if you will, combat stress resilience. We now have traumatic stress resilience. So it's it's also, I'm sorry, I'm doing the same thing, Dave. Live here. Thank you for, is it contagious up here? Or? Sex, yes, sex, good. Actually, that helped, now I remember. I meant combat stress injuries and traumatic stress injuries and sex. Yes, that's good. Say sex. In 2007, I published a book with a former now Navy captain psychiatrist, Bill Nash, and that we were trying to change the environment within the Marine Corps in particular, which I was a member of many millions of years ago, in order to avoid and prevent PTSD. So what we ended up doing is reviewing the literature to try to figure out what are all the factors associated with that. And then we were able to invent, in effect, here we go again. Combat, I want to use traumatic rather than combat, I'll just say. We were able to prevent combat-related behavioral disorders. And now, eventually, after several years now, we're now expanding that to other people. So what I want to share with you then is this traumatic stress injuries, and then talk about the 4 types of injuries, because what we're talking about here is secondary traumatic stress injuries, aren't we? That we potentially can be injured, stress injured, as a result of our work. So here's what we're, oh no, where's my model? Ah! Okay, I have no idea. I can't help you there. I'm sorry. All right. Sex. It's all right, deep breath. What's stress reduction at this week? Let me go before the conclusion, at least. No, I don't need a time. Here's what we have, if I can remember it. On the right side of the model is these injuries. And the injuries, I don't have it listed here. Before we only thought, well, trauma. So when you all are working with traumatized children and say, well, trauma is the thing that does it. It isn't just trauma. It isn't just a trauma injury that leads to post-traumatic stress disorder and all the, or compassion fatigue, or all the negative kinds of things. It isn't just that. There are several others. One is a belief injury. A belief injury suggesting that all children should be safe, that parents don't hurt their children, that children don't hurt other children. The notion that what is of fairness and social justice. And when you focus on that on a regular basis and see all these violations, it does affect us. So these belief injuries can turn into compassion fatigue because they're very discouraging. Another injury that's associated with post-traumatic stress disorder is grief. How many of you have had children that you've had as clients who died, not necessarily under your care, but that you know that they have died? Raise your hand. Look around the room. Raise your hand higher. So yes, it's trauma, and yes, it's traumatic, but it's a loss issue. It's a grief issue. And all those loss and grief issues that we have dealt with people that are at the end of their life cycle, we can deal with that fairly easily. But a child is very, very hard to deal with. Another injury is physical injury, to the extent that you're exhausted. And that week, day after day, week after week, in terms of this exhaustion, wears you down. And that there is ways of coming back because there's interventions to deal with each of these injuries. Right? So if it's physical exhaustion, you need to take a break. You need to take some time off. If it's a grief issue, you need to focus on that and to recognize, is it just the child that I'm grieving over? Or is it my innocence? Is it the child who lost their life in some stupid, ridiculous context? Is that really the issue? Or is it the fear of my own death? Or is the grieving of somebody else that I lost along the way, that is kind of blended together? Then, of course, there's the trauma, traumatic injury that I think most of you are aware of in that regard. Whenever we're traumatized, there are 5 questions that we address. And inevitably, when we're working in these kinds of contexts, these happen all the time. If you are an agency and you have a notification that a child was injured that was on the caseload, or if you see a child being injured in particular, 5 questions that apply to any kind of traumatic event, any kind of adverse incident. What happened? Why did it happen? And here's the critical part with regard to professionals. Why did I act the way I did at the time? You know, in other words, culpability, incompetence, fear. Because we're always second-guessing ourselves. We're always reevaluating how well we do. So what happened? Why did it happen? Why did I act the way I did at the time? How many of you can remember specific, you can recall as if it's yesterday, specific traumatic events in your life? Just one, at least one. Raise your hand. So they never really go away, and certainly therapy enables us to sort of take the sting out. So what happened? Why did it happen? Why did I act the way I did then? Why have I acted the way I have since that time? Because frequently that lets us know, whoa, I keep thinking about this. Why is that? And that it's significant. You can't let it out of your mind. But fundamentally, with regard to the traumatic stress injury, or combat stress injury, either way, talking about those things, is the final question, and that is, what if this happens again? Will I be so lucky the next time? Will I be able to cope from this? So if we're able to identify them, and I'll talk to you about some of the factors associated with that in a second, but if we are able, great, if we are able to do something about it, if we're able to figure out and answer those questions that enable us to understand the situation, we can let it go. Invariably, when we figure out the lessons of a particular event, then there's no need for it any longer. There's no need for the memory any longer, and the emotion associated with that is not necessary as well. So it's those particular 4 types of injuries then, knowing about it, being aware of it, as a therapist for those that have compassion fatigue, or colleagues, family members, that we can do something about it specific to the type of traumatic injury. Now, how did we get there? Well, again, those things we were born with is where we start. All the way to the left side of the model is associated with the traits, things that we're born with. We've talked about them already. Actually, a sense of humor is one of them. And certainly intelligence, and we've heard about some of these already, and resilience. There is several models, and you have them in front of you, at least 2 of them, that are excellent in terms of being able to determine those things that are, by your nature, resilient. The second thing, in terms of categories that it feeds right into, is much like what we talked about in terms of state resilience. And that is our ability to manage the situation by additional training, education, like you have here, various kinds of skills and knowledge that enable us to manage our stress, but also deliver as good a service as we possibly can. The next set of boxes then are associated with the specific adversities that we have to deal with. The adversities that we've talked about already, of the danger, of the sadness, of discouragement, the increase in paperwork, the decrease in funding, those sorts of things that we have to deal with on a regular basis. And then the next block before the injuries are really associated with our reactions. How do we react? Because how many of you know people that they tend to be very expressive and tend to let you know when they're upset? Anyone, any members here? So in that whole process, then they're easy to spot. But what are the effects on us physically, medically, psychologically, interpersonally, socially? spiritually. Yet, many of you raise your hand again if spirituality is a primary source of stress reduction for you. Raise your hand. Now, the whole notion of spiritual awakening as a result of a traumatic event, the whole notion of post-traumatic growth as a result of a traumatic event or injury, all of those are associated with spirituality and a sense of hope. So together, they would predict the kinds of injuries, and knowing the kinds of injuries, there's all kinds of strategies then to deal with, address, and be able to manage those specific injuries. So now I will turn to the conclusion. That is, take the test when you can, and what feedback that should provide you. I think you might find a certain degree of surprise at how resilient you are. And interesting, when I have much more time to do these workshops and people complete this, then they start talking about why they believe they're resilient as a result of this test, and they hadn't thought about it before. You deserve attention, as much attention as you provide to your clients at the very least. In order to be able to survive this work and be able to manage and enjoy it, you have to, in effect, pay attention to yourself using empathic discernment, using your own self-compassion. And finally, be good to yourself, and you will definitely be good to your clients. Thank you very much for your time. And,